This podcast is brought to you by Focusrite, legendary makers of class-leading audio interfaces and mic pre's. Check out Focusrite's Red range, their finest interfaces to date, along with the Claret Thunderbolt range and Scarlett, the best-selling USB audio interface range in the world. Focusrite makes music easy to make. Learn more at Focusrite.com.
Hey, it's Larry Crane. Welcome to the Tape Op Podcast. Tycho's Scott Hansen is a busy man. As the frontman, principal songwriter, producer, as well as the creator of the band's album art and live visuals, he has no shortage of things on his plate. Online publisher Geoff Stanfield sat down with Scott on a morning before a show in Seattle to talk about his process, translating his brand of ambient electronic music into a compelling live show, and the intersection of music and visual art.
This audio recording was not originally tracked with the intent of using for a podcast. It was recorded solely for transcription for our print interview. Please forgive any balance issues, background sounds, or lack of clarity. Enjoy.
Curious how your first early entries and forays into recording and making music.
Yeah, so when I came back from San Francisco and moved back to downtown Sacramento, that's when I really started kind of playing around with stuff. I started messing with like drum machines and synthesizers. And then I finally got a sampler, and I think that's when it kind of took off for me, because I realized I could like record stuff back into it, and that was when like the concept of chopping things up and moving them around. And I think that's what really was the first thing that made me think like, okay, this is something I can do. Like I can actually make musical compositions instead of just play with this stuff.
Right, and besides the sampler, were you using 4 tracks or?
No, so I never used any recording medium before that. I mean, I transferred stuff to tape and mini disc, like once it was done. But like, when it came to composing, I never used anything before that sampler. And then I eventually got a computer and learned how. I didn't realize computers could record audio at the time, because mine was so old. I don't think it probably could.
Were you always sort of drawn to just instrumental music?
Yeah, well, I mean, no, I listened to rock and singer-songwriter stuff and folk like most of my life. But then when I went away to college in San Francisco, I kind of started going to shows and stuff, like electronic shows, and realized like, oh, it was just like a type of music I'd never heard, and that's what piqued my interest and got me interested in making music. Because that was the only music I'd ever heard that I was like, I think I could at least begin to try to dissect that. Where it's like, with normal music, I didn't play guitar or any of those instruments at the time, so it seemed really foreign and basically impossible to break into that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So on your latest record, what was the process like? How do you start?
So like with this one, I work with Zach a lot now, Zach Brown. He's from Sacramento too. And so, usually I kind of work up some ideas, and then I spend, a few months with them, like turning them into something that I would consider like a comp, at least, like a demo. And then Zach will come in and we'll start playing back and forth with the idea, and then I'll take it back for a while and then do the full production and arrangement. And then he'll come back and we'll basically strip it down and try to figure out what it's about, and like take out everything that doesn't need to be there and just like make it cleaner and kind of for the final version. And then we've actually started like on the last 2 records, or the last ones we mainly worked together on them, and we went up to Tahoe for like the first couple weeks on both of those, and just kind of tried to jam and like figure stuff out. And that was kind of the first time I've gone about it that way, and that was pretty fun. Some of it worked out, some of it didn't, but it's really good because it lays a nice foundation for the rest of the stuff.
And are you inspired by a melody, or is there a sound? Are you starting with, sitting down with a synth or a guitar and coming up with a melody, or translating a melody that was in your head, or are you?
Yeah, it's probably half and half now for guitar and synths. I've really gotten into guitar over the last probably 10 years, just focusing on that, just because I got so used to keyboards that it's like you kind of start to play the same thing over, or at least I do start to play the same thing over and over again. But also, I think the thing that really inspires me at the beginning for the initial kind of spark is the timbre, like the actual sound and the texture and the effects and all that. So like that's usually, it kind of like writes itself at that point. Like you'll start playing a synth patch that's really interesting, and then it's just like this melody comes out of it, and that's usually kind of the basis. Or you'll start playing into a pedal chain, and you're like, whoa, and you hear this echo doing this thing, and it makes you think, oh, maybe this should go that way. So I think that's usually what really is the spark for everything, is the initial kind of like the sound, and then the melody comes out of that.
Such a visual aspect to your music, and to me there's like a really clear color connection to the music, and almost presents itself as color to me when I listen to it. I know you're a visual artist as well. How does the visual, or does the visual sort of inform your writing?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say that either really informs each other. I think they come from the same place, so it's just a different, it's a flip side of the same, or two different sides of the same coin or whatever. I think there's definitely a lot of overlap, and there's instances where, especially lately, I feel like I create the artwork after the fact most of the time now. So I'm definitely trying to create something that captures the spirit of what I think the music is about, but at the same time, it's never like this is a one-to-one translation. It's more just like filling in gaps maybe left by the sound, or vice versa.
How for you do the sounds and the composition sort of translate into a story? How is the story developed for you that way?
Yes, I think there's two different types of songs that end up on the records, and I think the first one would be things that are like, for me at least, like really personal, emotional kind of spaces, where it's like, okay, this is like kind of speaking to this, maybe not an event or a specific thing, but just this kind of emotional space. And those don't really seem to have a story for me. They really just kind of hit me in the gut, and it's like, you just feel, you get taken back to this feeling. But then there's others that are more these like open-ended soundscape type things, and I think those, when I'm making them, they are just like, wow, this is really interesting, and I keep following that path and adding and taking these turns, and by the end of it, that's when, after I've had you've listened to it a million times, it becomes kind of numb, but after the album's done and you've had some space, then I'll come back to it, because I have to do the visuals for it, for the show. And so the visuals don't always reflect exactly what I'm hearing, but basically that's when the songs start to take on almost like a narrative, and you can see this movie being played along to them. And I have all these like kind of, usually I'll write that down or like storyboard it up. So I have all those, but I haven't had the time or the resources to really make like a true narrative, like film type thing, but it's something I hope to be able to do eventually. But there's some songs, like Montana or Rings or Epoch, those really have a very solid narrative element to them, for me at least.
You talk about nostalgia and longing and childhood and natural environment. I mean, how do you work to translate those emotions and narrative into sound? I guess one of the things that I noticed, especially following your social media, is that you're often posting beautiful landscapes and stuff. And I think that, listening to the music and then seeing through your eyes and your camera, often there's a marriage there. Those two things go together well.
Yeah.
How much does the natural world influence your writing? And
I think, they're inextricable, and I think I'm not sitting there like being like, oh, this is, I'm writing about the beach or I'm writing about this, but I just think those things were the natural world and rural areas was the backdrop of my childhood, and so that was always something that I feel like was like core to my existence, or I saw that as like that was the whole world to me. So like I think that's where all this stuff is coming from, whether I'm trying or not. But I do think that it's becoming more like that's the kind of like palette, and now these emotional spaces are becoming more of the content, because I feel like as I get older and I've gone through like this iterative process of like speaking to all these elements that were inspiring me at the time, I've kind of turned more and more inward and trying to like work through, some more personal themes or just things that I feel like are more of like an internal space. And I don't think that's been a conscious choice. That just seems to have been what's happened over the last couple records. So I think, those spaces still inspire me, but it used to be like I was truly like, okay, how do I, evoke this idea or whatever? And then I was mixing that with the other stuff. But now I think it's kind of turning in the other direction. I think this record might have been the end of that kind of path, and now it'll be some different formula of those, some different mix of those two things. But up until now, that's kind of been the way I've been turning.
Yeah, it's sort of a unique challenge, I guess, because you're not playing vocal music or things with lyrics. How do you present new ideas? Yeah.
I think, for me, it goes it's back to the sound, the textures and the actual. It's not just really about the notes, because I'm sure if you broke the music down, it's not the most complex music in the world. It's not like like a music PhD would probably be that's pretty simple stuff. But for me, it's about the engineering and the sound design and all those things. I think that's just as important, because there was music like Boards of Canada and Ulrich Schnaus and the stuff that originally inspired me, where you could just hear, or Fotek especially. I think he was the first person where I was like, what is that sound? Like, I've never heard anything like that. He was a drum and bass guy. And you just hear these bass tones and these textures behind it, and it would be like literally just one pad, like one chord for like 5 minutes, but it was like so interesting, and it moved in such an interesting way that it was really powerful.
How do you pull this all off live?
So yeah, that was, I used to just be in a laptop, and it was not in a keyboard, and it was like not something I was really like proud of on a nightly basis. I wasn't like, that was cool, or like I can see why somebody would enjoy this. It was more like, because I think back in the day, like the artists that I was into, I'd go see them live, and it would be like, okay, it's just the guy there, but it didn't matter, because you just wanted to hear their music on a loud sound system, and the guy's actually there, and it's like, there's something about that was enough for me. But then I saw Ronnie Size represent, like 1996, I think. They came to San Francisco and played at Bimbo's, and I was just expecting, because I'd seen LTJ Buckham and a couple other kind of like English drum and bass DJs, and it was just them basically DJing. And so he had like a drummer and a bassist and all this stuff, and it just blew my mind. And I think that planted the seed. It wasn't until maybe a decade later that I hooked up with Zach. And I basically just started asking him to come over and kind of open-ended riff over songs. Like, we didn't even have songs together yet, and he was just playing over them. And then we slowly started. It was kind of like, oh, this is cool. And so I started having him play on stuff for the records. And then when we got our first offer to play a tour, I think it was open up for Little Dragon in like 2011, and we hired a drummer, and it kind of just evolved from there. I think I saw the other person was Caribou. At the same time, he had been doing this thing, and I'd seen him a few times, and I was like, man, that's so engaging. So anyways, yeah, we built this band around it, and I'm not sure if you want me to go deep into the technical aspects of it, but yeah, basically we use SMPTE as like the core timer, and that sends signals out to all of our ears, and Rory is obviously kind of like the timekeeper of the whole thing. He's the drummer. And yeah, I tried to focus on the elements that were the most important from the songs and take those and push them to the forefront, because I think this kind of music is, it's kind of headphone music at a certain point. It's more, it doesn't have to be, but it can serve the purpose of being background music very well. If you're focusing or studying or working or something like that. So that's obviously not what you want in a live context. So I tried to take it and punch out these elements and say, like, here's the drums, put them right up front, and here's the guitars, and here's the melody, make it like, way louder than the record. And so, that's what the show is about, is like taking the songs and pushing the energy of them and driving everything a little bit harder when it comes to the sound. We're driving all the preamps harder, and we're using tones that probably wouldn't use on the record. But then the interesting thing is that after doing that for years, like with Dive, really that wasn't a live record. I made all that kind of like by just playing little parts and chopping them together. But then Awake, the idea was like, let's try to capture that. And so Rory, was playing drums at the very beginning, and Zach and I, we were all playing the parts that kind of really playing the whole part and trying to make it feel live. And so the records have slowly kind of like caught up with the live show. And now I feel like with the new record, songs like Division and Slack are basically like live songs, So that's I pushed the drums way to the forefront and pushed all these elements up front that kind of used to hang in the back to try to make it this more visceral, kind of in your face experience. If I don't think in your face would ever be what people would describe the music as on the record or live, but still, that's the idea.
Well, it's cool, and it gives something different. Maybe people don't want to go see the live. They don't want the live show to be just the record playing.
Yeah,
so that's that.
I mean, some people do, and I think, that's the thing is, Tame Impala has always been an interesting kind of reference point for me, and it's just interesting to see their progression. It seems like they've gone on this kind of cyclical, like, sounds just like the record, sounds super live, sounds like the record. It could have just been the venues and the where I saw them in the day it happened to be. But it's just been interesting to hear those elements come to the forefront and go to the background and kind of gauging, like, what is it that I want. That's been something that's taught me what I personally wanted out of a live show, just to be able to see the same band do both things multiple times. So, I try to keep a balance with these things. I want the people who really want to hear all those textures and all those interesting elements, like in this big, larger than life space. But then I also want to have it feel live and have there be a connection between what you're seeing and what you're hearing, instead of like, there's a lot of things where I'm playing a keyboard or guitar into like 100% wet reverb and delay, and it's like you really wouldn't even know what's going on. It's just kind of a guy going like this, and then you hear this giant swell, because a lot of the synth parts aren't even synths, they're guitars, and there's synths sound like guitars and all that stuff. So those are the things that we're trying to translate and try to find some balance there. But for the most part, I think we tend towards live, especially now we're working with Peter Franco, the engineer, front of house engineer, and he worked with Daft Punk for a long time. So like from the studio to the stage, like he knows like the process of making something kind of feel live, and like I think he's taught me a lot about what people are looking for and how things can sound like a studio but still have that like live element to them. So we switched like our whole front of house system to analog, and we've tried to break as much as we can out of the box and done a lot of things to make it be like a much more closer connection, at least between us on stage with what people are hearing, because I think that was the problem. There was a disconnect where we were playing through all these super saturated, reverbed out channels, and it was kind of like, if you're not feeling it and you're not feeling that visceral connection, then the audience isn't. So he's kind of helped me unravel the thing and make it a little bit drier and more live.
And is he actually participating in like the mix of the show in terms of like a dub mixer would, is he participating in the performance outside of typical front of house?
Absolutely, yeah, it's crazy. Actually, and it's so fun to be on stage and like look at him, just like he's always just like so into it, and you can see he's doing all this stuff, and you're like that. Yeah, it makes you feel like, okay, this sounds amazing, and this is in the moment, and this is like the show's never going to sound like it does right now, tomorrow. So yeah, he's like really pushing those things. We used to have everything totally automated, and we were going through like digital mixers with full automation, and actually we used to mix it in the box for a long time. Like it was actually being mixed in Reaper. All you'd hear in front of house was just a 2-channel basically with the drums, and so yeah, it's like it feels like it's a lot more kind of like in your face, and I think he pushes the right elements at the right times, and he makes up for you either not sounding great that night or whatever. There's a lot of things where okay, it's like no matter what's going on stage, he's probably making it sound at least decent. so yeah, that's been really cool. That's kind of like the fifth member of the band at that
right.
point,
Kind of going back to the record making, on this last record you had Count mix it. What do you feel like that brings to the table?
Well, it was really difficult. The first kind of test of that process was with Dive, and that was, I met him at a show right before that album was right when I was finishing that up, and he was just like, oh, I can help you out with this. This is what I do, I mix stuff. And at the time I was really looking for that because I just felt like I'd really hit the limits of my abilities on that level. And it's by the time you're that deep in a project, it's like you have no reference point, and you're not able to be objective about your own work. And plus I just didn't have the technical skills to pull that off. So we started working on it, but he wanted to put it in Pro Tools. I use Reaper, and he wanted to put it in Pro Tools. So we did that, and we split it out, and it was just like, it was just too different. Like, and I had all these, there's all these interrelationships with side chaining and the compression and the buses and all this stuff in Reaper that was going on that kind of got blown out of the water. So I was just like, this isn't gonna work. I think a few of the songs ended up making the record that were done in Pro Tools, but basically the bulk of it, we took it back into Reaper, and I just kind of sat there with him, and he told me what to do, and then slowly he learned it enough to use it. And then with Awake, it was the same thing. And then this one, he's pretty good at Reaper now. So I just take my computer over to his studio, we set everything up, and we just sit down and kind of work through it together. And he does, at this point, it's become a really smooth process, and it's just crazy because like you have these songs, and I think it's not a negative thing. It's actually, it's a very positive thing. But by the end of it, you're so ready for these songs to be done, and he does all this stuff, and then all of a sudden, like, all these elements come out, and like all these problems and places where he screwed up become so apparent because it's not just this like muddy wall of sound anymore. So it's like, he puts the glasses on the mix, and then you're like, okay, well, we got 2 more weeks of work fixing this shit. And then so it's kind of a back and forth. But that's the cool thing about him working within Reaper, is I can just take that computer back home, work on the exact same session with the mix in place, and then take it back over to his place.
What part does software play in your recording? You were talking about, I know you use a lot of analog synths, and
Yep.
You just talked about kind of getting back to more analog process in your live show, but obviously there's some software involved. What are you using, and what role does that play?
Yes, software it's definitely the biggest, by far the biggest element of the whole process. I always use the analog front end. Obviously you have to use some sort of analog, but I use like Neve preamps or whatever, or distressors, like mostly for dynamics EQ and the pre, they're all analog. And then I use an Aurora converter. And then after that happens, pretty much for the last 2 records, with the exception of like really interesting effects like a Ursa Major reverb or something, there's pretty much no going back out of the box at that point. And we're using all sorts of stuff, the Soundtoys stuff, Waves, UAD. Lately I just got into UAD and PSP and all that stuff, and then a ton of soft synths actually. I'll play the initial melodies, and like the meat of it is there, and then it's like, well, this should have a pad. Especially during the later phases, it's like, well, if there's something needed, for the most part, like overdubs, I'll try to do VSTIs so I can keep them open-ended and edit them. But then at the end, we do analog summing and sometimes use like analog bus compression, but it's pretty rare. We mostly just do the summing, so we go out through that and then come back into the master bus with Reaper. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, the core of it is Reaper, which is a DAW and kind of Swiss Army knife for audio.
You referenced Boards of Canada, and I think if there's a closest sibling, you and Boards of Canada, and texturally and sonically, you're using some of the same voices, I guess, is a
Absolutely,
good term. it's just the saddest sound ever, you know. And I hear it on all your records, and it's certainly the Boards of Canada's vibe as well.
Yeah, it's probably not a particular synth. I mean, I use the Mini Moog a ton on everything, and I don't know. I'm sure they use that or something similar. But yeah, I think it's that like VHS like kind of tape wobble, like old, like, you know, it just sounds like memories or something. It sounds like when you're a kid listening to your parents' 8-track or something like that. I think there's something to that. And, you know, there's definitely like a patina or a texture that I try to put on a lot of the stuff to give it. You know, it's the same with the graphic design. Whereas, you know, you can design something in Illustrator with like these perfect lines, and you can create these posters that are like, there's all these stark contrasts, and it looks, you know, it just looks like it was created by a computer. But then I'll take it into Photoshop and blur the edges or layer some paper over it and use some sort of process to make it feel more almost like a photo of an old poster, which is kind of what the music I want that to be. Is I want it to sound like samples. I want the actual make my own playing sound like it was sampled from an old record or something like that. But I think that's becoming less and less. I'm trying to capture what is the element of that's hitting people and having some sort of emotional response, and kind of focus in on that and take away all the dirty artifacts of that process, because I feel like for me, those were cool, and it was a time and place, and I enjoyed that kind of filtered sound. But more and more, especially with the latest record, I'm trying to get this kind of hi-fi sound while still maintaining those nostalgic kind of familiar elements, but strip away like the ugly things that come along with it.
How has the sound of Tycho evolved?
I think at the beginning, I was definitely going for that Boards of Canada thing where it's kind of this like super saturated, like almost like a Polaroid vibe. And like I was saying, you know, there's going to be this blur and this fading and this color shift when you do that. But over time, I think I became more and more interested in the engineering side of it, and you know, definitely Count enabled me to be thinking about those things and achieve the vision of sharpening the edge of all those things while maintaining the good elements. So I think that's a part of it, is just the true texture of the sound, like that the core of what it sounds like has evolved to be maybe cleaner and more focused. And then I think the writing has definitely evolved in a way that, you know, I've worked more and more closely with Zach, and then on the last record, Rory was involved as well. I mean, he played drums on Awake, but he was actually involved in some of the songwriting for a couple of the songs on the latest record. So I think in that way it's become more open to kind of other people's perspectives, and I think it's made it more interesting. And I think that's been the biggest part of the evolution for me, is at the end of the day, these songs are the sum total of a lot of people's ideas, instead of just this one thing that can become, I think over 10 or 12 tracks can become a little bit one note. So I'm definitely trying to, as much as I can, step into a producer role at times where it's just I'm there to like shepherd these sounds and these ideas and kind of push them into the Tycho sphere of you know, whatever that means, and bringing them into that space and putting my own textures and stuff on them, but at the same time it not being the original idea, not being mine. I think that there's something interesting about that to me now, where I think that might be the next phase, is going more and more into a band space, you know, as far as where the ideas come from.
Yeah, there's certainly something for you know, getting sick of yourself, so to speak, you know, and it's nice to have other people's contributions, and I always feel like any musical project I've ever been involved with, it's always nice to, those are the things that I enjoy hearing, are other people's ideas, and of course you tire of yourself.
Yeah, so. And I think like doing a lot of remixes taught me a lot about like working with an existing idea. A lot of times will inspire something that you'll come up with an idea, and maybe you'll throw that original thing out, but it's this framework that you built your idea around, and that's probably more interesting than something you would have come up with right away. And that's how I've always looked at the music, even when it's 100% my own song, is like try to remix your own music. So by the time whatever makes it on the record was hopefully like 2 steps removed from the original idea. I mean, there's some things where it's like that piano part that's always going to be there, but the rest of the song, like, you know, I like to keep changing it and keep starting over, basically being like, okay, what is the cool part of the song? Let's just do that again, but you know, strip everything else away. So I think that might become a quicker process when you're dealing with an initial idea by somebody else.
Yeah. Great.
Cool.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Find us online at tapeop.com, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time.